Straddling the border of Virginia and North Carolina, the Great Dismal Swamp was, to the colonial eye, a place of dread, a vast, dark, tangled wilderness of cypress trees, black water, poisonous snakes, an impenetrable thicket stretching across nearly 1,000,000 acres. William Byrd II, who surveyed the region in 1728, dismissed it as a horrible desert unfit for civilized habitation. To the enslaved men and women who fled into its depths, however, the swamp was something else entirely. A sanctuary, a fortress, and the foundation of one of the most remarkable and long-lived communities of free black people in North American history. The communities that formed in the swamp are often referred to collectively as the Great Dismal Swamp Maroon Confederation, though Confederation perhaps overstates the degree of formal political organization. What existed was a network of semi-autonomous Maroon settlements, linked by kinship, geography, shared experience, and a common commitment to freedom, persisting for well over a century, from roughly the early 1700s through and beyond the Civil War. Welcome to Historic Crimes TV, where you get the true story of events that have happened in the past which helped shape the history of the world that we are living in. My mother said I wouldn't even reach 1,000 subscribers. Help me show her that real-life stories like this matter and deserve to be heard by liking the video, where you are watching from, share it with someone and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The word maroon derives from the Spanish cimarron, meaning wild or untamed, originally applied to livestock that had escaped into the wilderness, and later to enslaved Africans and their descendants who fled bondage and established free communities beyond the reach of colonial or plantation authority. Maroon communities appeared throughout the Americas wherever slavery existed in Jamaica, Suriname, Brazil, Florida, and Louisiana, but the Great Dismal Swamp represented the largest and most enduring concentration of Maroon age in what would become the United States. The first runaways arrived in the swamp in the late 17th century, as tobacco plantations expanded across Tidewater, Virginia and North Carolina, and the demand for enslaved labor intensified. These early refugees came largely from the Bantu-speaking peoples of West Central Africa, from the Congo Basin, Angola, and surrounding regions, many of whom brought with them deep knowledge of wetland environments, river navigation, and forest survival. This knowledge was not incidental, it was foundational to the Maroon community's survival. Over the following decades, the population of the swamp grew steadily. Runaways came not only from nearby plantations but from as far away as the Carolinas and beyond, some traveling hundreds of miles on foot through hostile territory to reach the swamp. They came alone and in groups. Occasionally entire families vanished into the darkness together. Some were recently arrived Africans, others were American-born and had known nothing but bondage. A smaller number were free black people who found the margins of colonial society too precarious and dangerous, and Native Americans displaced from their ancestral lands who found common cause with the fugitives. What makes the Great Dismal Swamp Maroon Confederation so historically significant is not merely that people escaped into it, but that they built lives there, permanent, structured, culturally rich lives that endured across generations. The interior of the swamp was not the uniform nightmare outsiders imagined. Scattered across it were islands of relatively dry, elevated ground, hammocks and ridges rising a few feet above the surrounding water where soil could be cultivated and structures built. The Maroons found these islands and made them home. Archaeological excavations, particularly work conducted by Daniel Sayers of American University beginning in the 2000s, have revealed compelling physical evidence of these communities. On interior islands, researchers have found the remains of cabins, root cellars, and hearths. They have uncovered ceramic fragments, animal bones, indicating hunting and cooking, clay tobacco pipes, remnants of tools, and personal objects. The material record shows communities that were not merely surviving but living, cooking complex meals, maintaining crafts, practicing spiritual traditions, and passing knowledge from parents to children. Maroon settlements were typically organized around a central, more protected island, sometimes accessible only through deliberate, disorienting water routes that outsiders could not easily navigate, surrounded by satellite encampments and lookout positions. The geography of the swamp was itself weaponized for defense. The black tannic water, stained by cypress roots, left no tracks. The dense canopy broke up sound. The maze of waterways, passable only to those who knew them, could swallow a pursuing militia whole. The Maroons maintained vegetable gardens, growing corn, squash, and other crops in the thin soil of the hammocks and hunted the swamp's abundant wildlife, deer, bear, wild turkey, turtles, and fish. They gathered berries, nuts, and medicinal plants. Some traded carefully and covertly with poor white laborers, free black watermen, and sympathetic individuals on the swamp's margins, exchanging shingles, cut from the swamp's prized cedar and cypress trees, or other goods for iron tools, gunpowder, cloth, and salt. The Maroons were not entirely cut off from the outside world. They existed within a shadow economy, participating in illicit networks of trade and information that stretched across the region's waterways and backroads. Some scholars believe these networks were more extensive and sophisticated than previously imagined, that the swamp communities were, in a sense, nodes in a broader web of black resistance across the plantation South. One of the most striking aspects of the swamp communities, as suggested by the archaeological record and historical accounts, is the degree to which they maintained and developed a distinct cultural identity. The Maroons' African heritage remained alive in the swamp in ways that plantation life, with its surveillance and suppression, could not easily permit. Spiritual practices rooted in Bantu cosmology and ancestor veneration appear to have persisted. Objects found at archaeological sites, certain ceramic arrangements, the placement of personal items near hearths suggest ritual practices associated with African religious traditions, particularly those surrounding the dead and the connection between the living and ancestral spirits. Music, oral tradition, and communal ceremony almost certainly played central roles in swamp life. The transmission of memory of African homelands, of the horrors of the Middle Passage, of daring escapes, of the names and deeds of those who had come before would have been central to community cohesion across generations. Children born in the swamp were born free, and this fact carried enormous psychological and cultural weight. To be born free in a land saturated with slavery was to occupy an almost revolutionary position. These children grew up knowing no master, learning to read the swamp, to move silently through water, to identify edible plants and medicinal roots, and to maintain the vigilance that freedom in such a context demanded. The swamp communities were not passive refuges. The Maroons of the Great Dismal were active participants in the broader struggle against slavery, and at times their activities extended well beyond the swamp's borders. Historical records contain recurring references to raids from the swamp. Maroon raiding parties would emerge at night to strike nearby plantations, liberating enslaved people, seizing food, tools, and weapons, and disappearing back into the darkness before dawn. These raids served multiple purposes. They resupplied the interior communities, they grew their numbers, and they sent a message of defiance to the planter class that no plantation near the swamp's edge was entirely safe. Colonial and later state authorities periodically organized armed expeditions into the swamp to destroy the Maroon settlements. These ventures were almost universally unsuccessful. Militia companies blundered through chest-deep water, lost their bearings in the featureless interior, and found only the ashes of abandoned fires. On the rare occasions when they did locate a settlement, they were met with determined resistance, the Maroons fighting with the advantage of terrain knowledge, prepared defensive positions, and a ferocity born of absolute necessity. Capture meant death, mutilation, or re-enslavement. There was no incentive to surrender. The fear that the swamp communities inspired among Virginia and North Carolina planters was genuine and pervasive. Newspaper notices from the 18th and early 19th centuries repeatedly mention runaways believed to have headed for the Dismal. Reward amounts escalated. Legislation was passed attempting to criminalize any trade or communication with swamp inhabitants. None of it worked. The early 19th century brought new pressures and new complexities to the swamp communities. The establishment of the Dismal Swamp Canal, completed in 1805, brought white laborers, many of them Irish immigrants, into closer proximity to the swamp's interior. Timber operations expanded. The swamp shrank somewhat at its margins as drainage projects advanced. At the same time, the scale of slavery in the region was intensifying dramatically. The expansion of cotton cultivation in the Deep South, the domestic slave trade, and the growing brutality of the antebellum period all drove more people toward the swamp. Population estimates for the Maroon communities vary widely. Colonial records are unreliable and deliberately vague, but figures ranging from several hundred to several thousand inhabitants at various points have been proposed by historians. The swamp was large enough to sustain a significant hidden population. The abolitionist movement of the 1830s and 1840s brought new attention to the swamp communities. Writers and activists referenced them as proof that enslaved people would, given any opportunity, choose and fight for freedom. The poet Thomas Moore had visited the swamp in 1803 and written about its mysterious runaways. Later, the swamp and its fugitive inhabitants became a charged symbol in the broader cultural debate over slavery. Frederick Law Olmsted, traveling through Virginia and North Carolina in the early 1850s, spoke with people who had direct knowledge of the swamp communities and reported that the inhabitants were numerous, well organized, and had established a degree of self-sufficiency that startled outside observers. They subsist by hunting, fishing, and cultivating small patches of ground, he wrote, noting that some had lived in the swamp for years, even decades without ever being recaptured. In 1856, 1 year after Uncle Tom's Cabin had transformed American culture, Harriet Beecher Stowe published her second anti-slavery novel, Dread, A Tale of the Great Dismal Swamp. The novel drew directly on the documented reality of Maroon communities in the swamp, centering on a fictional Maroon leader, partly inspired by the revolutionary preacher Nat Turner, who organizes a community of freedom seekers in the swamp's interior. Dread was less successful than Uncle Tom's Cabin but was important as a cultural document, bringing the swamp's hidden communities to the attention of a national and international reading public. Stowe's research was genuine. She understood that what was happening in the Great Dismal was not mere escape but the construction of an alternative society, a refutation, in living form, of every pro-slavery argument that claimed African Americans were unfit for freedom. When the Civil War reached Virginia, the Great Dismal Swamp's significance shifted dramatically. Union forces recognized the swamp as a refuge and a potential resource. Enslaved people fled plantations in enormous numbers, and many made for the swamp. Maroon inhabitants who had lived there for years emerged cautiously, then more boldly as the presence of Union troops made the surrounding region less hostile. The Union Army established Camp Hamilton and other contraband camps on the edges of the swamp, and black men from the region, including likely some with roots in the Maroon communities, eventually enlisted in the United States colored troops. The swamp had been, for these men and their families, both a school of survival and a crucible of identity, and now that identity found new expression in armed service under a flag that had, at last, come to mean something to them. After emancipation, many former inhabitants of the swamp communities settled in the towns and rural communities on its margins in areas like Camden, Currituck, and surrounding counties in North Carolina and Virginia. Their descendants remain in these communities today, carriers of a history that was, for too long, unknown to most Americans.